Hello, Skye. I think it's us now. Hello, good to see you. But such a moving film, and I was so pleased to hear just now from Dr. Al Sadiq reminding us about the work that she's done. She really does come across as one of the true heroes of what is happening in a place where clearly there are very few heroes. She is clearly one of them. Um, One has to be so moved by this film. I've watched it several times, and seeing the faces of the children, the faces of the parents, the faces of the doctors, the healthcare providers in these hospitals, they are unforgettable. I want to start by asking you, Skye, how you decided to go in. This war started a little over 6 years ago. How did you decide to go there and to do this? How did this all come about?
Well, so Hunger Ward it's the third film in a trilogy that started as sort of this loose exploration of how displacement because of war and conflict was taking place, playing out in different ways throughout the world. So the first film I actually shot with a Syrian American surgeon who was volunteering as an orthopedic surgeon on the border between Syria and Turkey. And then the second film was shot on a rescue mission on the Mediterranean off the coast of Libya, sort of studying and exploring how asylum seekers were trying to cross the central Mediterranean. And Hunger Ward, the capstone of the trilogy, really came about because once I learned how the shift in asylum seekers had moved from the central Mediterranean eastwards across the Red Sea and up the west coast of Yemen, the scale of that displacement that was happening internally in the country, married with these asylum seekers who were traveling up the west coast to try to get to Saudi Arabia, it just really piqued my interest. And I think the final element that really convinced me this was a film I needed to do was when I learned the depth and the level of our own country's involvement in the conflict and how we were actually actively catalyzing the conflict by supporting Saudi Arabia.
And at that point, when did you actually shoot this film? When did you go in and film?
We filmed in January and February of 2020. So, and then returned just almost exactly a month before sort of global travel was shut down because of the pandemic.
Yeah, that was a question I think everyone is asking because you don't see masks. And I can only imagine how much more difficult it would have been to try to get the permission that you had. But tell us about finding the places you went to. You found these two, one hospital where the most severe cases are seen, the other a clinic. How did you go about finding them? How did you make the connections? Tell us about that process.
Yeah, it was a lot of conversations with colleagues for the most part. So, Nick Kristoff and Giles Clark, a photographer, and a team of New York Times photographers made it in the fall of 2018. And so they really published a series of photos that were just harrowing and stunning in terms of how the famine was progressing in the country. So I had a conversation with Christoph and then his photographer via email. And then I had a number of conversations with journalists who had been able to successfully get in and out of the country in the previous 18 months. And all of them, to a T, mentioned both Makia at the Aslam Clinic in the north and Dr. Al Sadiq at Sadaqah Hospital, just because of the depth of their commitment to saving every child that walked in the door, despite the incredible challenges in a conflict zone to do so.
That is the thing that comes across so powerfully in the film, is the dedication of these two women and of course the people who are working with them against all odds. I mean, seeing what they see every day. And I want to ask you about, of course, the outside forces in a moment, but what keeps them going?
I think if people were paid based on their actual contribution to society, rather than economic impact, I think both Makia and Aida would be billionaires because of the work they do. And I think that's what keeps them going as well, the work that they do. They believe deeply that, especially in a conflict zone, when children are the most impacted by that conflict, that it is their duty as a physician and a nurse, but just simply as a human being, to make sure they save as many of those children as possible, because they know they're the most vulnerable in the conflict. And they really have just committed their lives to ensuring that with their own skill set and the relatively meager institutional resources they have, they're going to use the expertise and the skill that they've built up over years to continue the work no matter what comes. And so I think it's the act of working itself and the knowledge and hope that they can save yet another child that gets them up in the morning.
What you're showing in when we see these children either in the hospital or the clinic with their parents is for many of them the end of the line. I mean, this all starts months earlier in their lives or years earlier, when they begin to be deprived of the nutrition that they need. Take us back to that point. What is it that has interrupted the food? We know there's a war going on, but what is it exactly that has interrupted the ability of so many civilians in Yemen to get nutrition, to get the food they need?
Well, it's a multiplicity of factors. It's not just a single answer to that. So there's a blockade over the country, a Saudi-imposed blockade that has shut down the airport in Sana'a, of course, as well as disrupted the free and easy flow of diesel and foodstuffs that the World Food Program tries to get into the port of Hadeda. So that blockade does and has done enormous damage for years now. Critical medicine can't get in. Certain foodstuffs can't get in a timely enough fashion before they spoil. But there's also, sanctions, right? There's financial sanctions that have been in place for a long time that have caused inflation to just spike incredibly. So even when there is food in the markets, and there is food in the markets in many places, many people can't afford to buy it. And that's just a terrible irony, is that many families see the food and literally cannot access it because they don't have the money to buy it. And then I think the more insidious nature of long-term hunger. As you noted, this war has been going on for over 6 years now. And as the infrastructure has been destroyed, as jobs have disappeared, as people have not been paid sometimes for years, hunger becomes chronic. And when a mother, bears a child and she weighs 70 pounds, that starvation begins in the fetus, right, for that child. So there's a whole generation of children now who have been born in this state of moderate acute malnutrition, MAM is the term, and sometimes even as a Sam's case, a severe acute state of malnutrition at birth. So they're starting stunted, right? They're starting without the normal resources that a young child would have. And then it becomes prolonged and chronic as they age.
And how do the families, I mean, we can only imagine this, but we assume that most families are not able to get to the hospital. Perhaps some are to the clinic, but getting to the hospital has to be a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it is. It's very, very difficult. And there's a lot of different kinds of challenges that accompany just getting healthcare, right? So one is, because it's a conflict zone, different areas are controlled by different warlords and militias. And so if a family lives 200 kilometers, say, from a specialty clinic like Sadaka or Aslam, they might have 25 roadblocks or security checkpoints they have to go through to get to that specialty medical care. So that's one challenge unto itself. And then there's just the resources to travel that far, the money it takes to either buy the diesel or the gasoline to get there or to hire a taxi. Um, and one of the amazing things that Makia, I witnessed Makia do when we were there, was she has a couple motorcycles, and she has a couple staff that she's brought on, and their only job is to go out to these villages, right? Seek out the cases who don't have the wherewithal, the resources to travel to the clinic, and they're
Right.
stopped on the back of these motos on really mountainous areas, and they're driven to the clinic.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
There, I think you had a shot in there of the motorbike.
Yeah, there was one.
And I mean, as a parent, of course, I'm putting myself in the shoes of these parents and trying to imagine what it's like for them. Do they, to what extent do they understand how this war is working and why it is that they're in the situation they're in?
Oh, I think there's a pretty widespread understanding of the nature of the conflict on multiple levels. Even though it started as really a civil war initially,
Right.
it is obviously transformed into something far beyond that. And they know who the players are because they're there in their country, and they're bombing the north of the country as well. So the refrain that I heard over and over again when we talked with our colleagues and collaborators was that as soon as the foreign powers intervention stopped and the Emiratis intelligence forces left and Saudi Arabia stopped bombing the north and the US stopped supporting the Saudi coalition, that they would resolve it, that they would find a way to sort of bring their society back together, rebuild their government, and find a way for Ansar Allah in the north and the different factions in the south to handshake and to build a coalition government.
So these are civilians you're talking to who have that view.
Yes, correct.
People you interviewed, people you spoke with.
Correct. Yeah, in the dozens, maybe. Yeah, in the dozens for sure.
To what and where does the blame lie for them?
Whew. I think this is a conflict that they understand there's blood on many hands, that very few parties have clean hands in this conflict, and I heard over and over again that I think the most anger that I witnessed and heard was against Saudi Arabia. That was the refrain that I heard over and over again. But I think it's also acknowledged that there are many parties to the conflict, and you can't just point a finger at one.
What about the reaction to you as an American and what you heard about the United States from people you spoke with?
Yeah, we were, the South is such a fractured entity, right? Hadi, the globally recognized, president, is in Riyadh. And there are so many different forces at play in the South that it's a very fractious place. And we had to tread very, very carefully in that fractured landscape because there's so many warlords controlling different areas. So in that area, we were just treated as almost like an NGO worker. Like someone who was there for a very narrow, concrete purpose to it would be rendering aid if we were an NGO. In this case, it was to tell a story. In the North, we were treated very differently because of the incredible control that Ansar Allah has over the north of the country. So, we felt much safer in the North, ironically, because they have such control over the ground. But also, it's a politically charged space where, almost every rock on the side of the road and almost every vehicle has "Death to America" painted on it, right? And so, while that is propaganda on one hand, it also, it makes you sit up in your chair too. So we had minders with us, government minders, Houthi government minders that were assigned to us whenever we were in the field, and we couldn't avoid that.
Did you have minders everywhere you went, or just in the north? What is that? What you're
Yeah, just in the north, just in
just
the
in the north?
in the
Okay,
south.
different picture in the
Yeah, exactly.
in the south. Talk a little bit about what the understanding there is with regard to the international aid groups and the blockade, and the fact that there is help that would be getting in, but it's not.
You know, there are a lot of conflicted views about NGOs in the country. I would say I did see a clear demarcation of thinking on that between the North and the South. So in the South, I think, generally speaking, NGOs are seen as, you know, capable and helpful institutions that can, you know, sort of mitigate the effects of the conflict to some extent. You know, whether it's through mobile clinics that go out to offer healthcare in IDP camps, or the delivery of food. In the North, it's a different case altogether, and it's because of, you know, the somewhat tortured relationship between Ansar Allah and many of the aid agencies. And you know, that comes from sort of a long-standing dispute between many of the aid agencies and Houthis' claims that a lot of the money that's paid to the NGOs is diverted inappropriately. And so there's not a lot of trust between Ansar Allah and many of the NGOs in the North, and that's unfortunate because it really does slow down the effectiveness of the aid in the North.
And were you able to talk to, I know you, obviously this is a trilogy and you worked on the blockade story earlier, but what do the aid agencies say to you about what's going
on? I mean, in a phrase, it would be, we need help. It's that this is the scale of what's happening there is just, you know, almost hard for the mind to grasp. You know, there's this researcher here in Oregon, where I am, at the University of Oregon, who uses this term psychic numbing. And, you know, he wrote an article about a month ago where he used this phrase, that more people that die, the less we care. And that's really stuck with me, you know, because it's, you know, I think it's important because it can affect our real world response to something of incredible scale, a human tragedy of incredible scale, like's happening in Yemen. And so I think, you know, it's easy to be numbed by numbers. And I think that happens sometimes in the general public. And it's one of the dangers right now with the Yemeni conflict, because, you know, we've been hearing for years, you know, X number of children need food, X number are dying, you know. I mean, the fact that 100,000 people, I think that's the accurate number, have now died of starvation in Yemen in modern day times, that ought to make us sit up in our chair, right? And yet it's such a big number to have died of starvation that I think sometimes we don't know what to do with that kind of information. That's the challenge that NGOs are facing in the country, is that the need is so great and the resources aren't there to meet it.
Yeah, that to me is, I mean, obviously there are a lot of very difficult questions raised by this, but at some point there is a numbing effect when the numbers are so great and the answers are so complicated and so difficult. And yet it's not as if there couldn't be a political will to make a change. I keep thinking about the families that persist, the families that are still managing somehow to get to survive through this, and what it is at their core. I asked you about this a moment ago, but I mean, there must be something strong inside the Yemeni people to keep them going.
There's a resilience, for sure, a resilience of spirit, absolutely. And I'm hopeful that resilience of spirit will carry them through far beyond the current conflict and long after it's resolved. I have faith in that, and I think, you know, it's one of the I think Yemen is been inhabited longer than almost any other region in the world, right? And I think that will serve the region well once the bombs stop dropping and the blockade is lifted.
Of course, what is behind what you are doing, in addition to your own great interest, is wanting so much to get the word out to the world about what's happening there. How much do you think the word is getting out? We know how difficult it is for journalists to get in at any time. And it seems to me it's not getting any easier. I mean, what my understanding is that it's more, perhaps even more complicated than ever to get in, not only because it's dangerous, but just because of all the permissions and the rest of it. And you mentioned the minders and so on. But do you think the word's getting out? I mean, how much do you want the word to get out, but how much do you think it is getting?
Well, it is a very difficult task, isn't it? It is a dangerous place, and yet I think that part of the irony is that whenever a journalist or a filmmaker does get in and is able to sort of get out a big story, the irony is then it becomes more difficult for the next journalist because sort of the hold on visas is tightened down. When they learn how a journalist gets in, then sometimes that access is sort of cut off. But that said, it's happening. The word is getting out. I think people are starting to listen, and I have a couple sort of things I can point to that I think support that. One is, as you know, at the first real press conference after Joe Biden took office, he spent a substantial amount of time in that first press conference talking about how the U.S. was altering its response to the Saudi coalition by ending all support for offensive operations in the country. Now, has that language been clarified sufficiently? Probably not, right? Have bombing raids continued over the country every single day since that statement? Yes, they have. And yet, there are over 200 different civil society groups lobbying very, very hard to ensure that senators and representatives know what's happening, know about U.S. complicity in the conflict. So I think there is momentum, and I think it's going to continue.
Over 200.
Yeah.
That's remarkable, and that number's grown.
Yeah.
Over time,
and continues
over the last 6 years.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're trying to leverage, of course, is this small moment where we have a slightly elevated stage, right? To also get Hollywood to pay attention, right? We were so fortunate that Mark Ruffalo, for example, has been active on Yemen, speaking out for years now, and Judd Apatow, we did a talk with him a while back, and he's starting to he knows about the conflict now and is starting to talk about it. So, I think there are ways that the conversation is really broadening in important ways, and I think that's going to create even more pressure over time.
What more do you want? I mean, we would love, we would all love for this to be resolved immediately, and for there to be enough food and for the famine to end as quickly as possible. But what more needs to be told, Skye, about what is happening in Yemen? What, if you could go back in there today, what are the other stories that you would want to share?
Well, if you remember, midway through the film, we do a sequence that covers a single missile attack on a memorial service. And, that particular attack happened in October of 2016, and it killed over 140 people. There were remnants of a missile manufactured by Raytheon, from their factory in Arizona, found in that wreckage. And, I knew that I wanted to cover sort of the fact that there's been this really aggressive, non-proportional bombing campaign over the north of the country for 6 years, and the effects that's having on people. And so we interviewed probably 12 to 15 different survivors of missile attacks. And I chose to distill it down into that one scene. And I did that because Ali Alakwa, the gentleman who holds up his cell phone immediately after one of the missile strikes and sort of does a 270
And
around this.
shows, yeah.
Yeah, we interviewed him. He invited us into his home. You know, we drank tea with him. We spent 3 or 4 hours just talking. And after he told us this incredible story of surviving this missile attack as a civilian, he pulled out his phone and he showed me that clip that we used, that he himself filmed. And to me, that's one of the most powerful, was one of the most powerful moments of making the film. That's the only moment that we use any footage that we didn't shoot ourselves in the film. And that is one story, Judy. That's one person's experience of missile attacks that have been happening for 6 years. That was a civilian event. That wasn't a military target. So I would go back in and I think I would do a film that sort of seeks to understand on a deeper level how that has played out over 6 years.
It's fascinating how you gain the trust of someone in a situation like that, and they share it with you. It was incredibly powerful. You think you've seen it, and then the other strike happens, and it's just
Yeah, and that was a triple tap. That was actually three missiles in that attack.
You're right. You're right. It was, as soon as you think it's over, it's not, and then it's not again.
Yeah.
So going back in and looking at how this is happening, how people are getting hurt, and as you say, Raytheon, pointing back to, to what the causes are, and those are the conversations that are being had right now in Washington.
And there's a great organization called Moatana in the country that has been documenting these missile strikes and bombings for the entire span of the year. And I think that would probably be the vehicle of how I would want to do it, is they have these on the ground researchers who literally go to each of the strikes, do eyewitness accounts, collect information, take photos, video, and they're doing this really incredible work to build an archive so that once the conflict has been resolved, right, they have a documented archive of war crimes that then they can take to the ICC or some other international body to try to prosecute some of these. And that's going to be really interesting years from now to see how that plays out, because there's this really rich, well-documented archive that they've been building over the years.
I want to end our conversation, Skye, by going back to these children and their families we saw. What happened, the ones who survive, who come through their clinic or hospital experience and they get just enough of help to make it through that, and then what happens when they go home? What are they facing?
They're facing potential displacement again, because the front lines continue to, they're pretty dynamic, especially in the areas where Omema came from, which is on the west coast of Yemen. And so she's been displaced multiple times during the course of the conflict, as has Abir. And that displacement has these really horrible effects, of course, on the family's ability to provide a livelihood. But from a health standpoint, they're both very fortunate relative to others in their village, because they did seek out specialty care at Sadaka and at the Aslam clinic. And once you're a patient there, one of the wonderful things that both Makia and Dr. Al-Sadiq does is they give their cell phones to the father or the mother or the uncle or the aunt, and they keep in contact with those families and they check in with them. And so if they stop driving again, right, they either send someone out to pick them up to bring them back to the clinic, or send the resources so they can do it via taxi or something. So they're fortunate in that respect, and they do keep in contact with all the patients in the long term.
How hard was it to say goodbye to them? I mean, I'm just thinking about how hard it is as a journalist, as a filmmaker, to go in and make a film like this when you know the circumstances are going to continue. You can leave and go about your work as you try to get the word out, get the message out. But they continue, they stay at it. Did you sense at the end that that they had any hope? I mean, how did they express what their view of the future is?
I think the simple fact that both, Omema's family and Abir's family received successful treatment for these beautiful young girls gave them hope. That was a hopeful act in and of itself. So actually, what I saw was that they left the clinic and the hospital in a more hopeful psychological space than they entered it. And so despite the challenges of returning to an area where they could again be displaced by conflict, their child is healthier now. Abir is thriving, as is Omema. And I think the simple act that a child's health has turned around is it's reason for hope. So all of them, though, dearly hope that the conflict will end so that life can sort of return to some semblance of normality.
And finally, what would you, I mean, there's so much to pull together, but what would your final message to an American audience be that you want this film to convey?
Yeah, I've always wanted this film to be a vehicle for change, and for people to get to the end of it and want to know more. But I guess the fundamental fact that I would want people to know is that we now live in a world where a 10-year-old girl can weigh 24 pounds. And that's happening because our taxpayer dollars are funding a blockade over the country. Now, I'm furious by that, and I would hope that my fellow Americans would be too.
Well, as we said, it's such a powerful film, and I hope it gets as much viewing as possible, that the people who are watching tonight can spread the word and just continue to spread the word, because that's how people learn. That's how they begin to take action in a case like this.
Absolutely.
Skye Fitzgerald, thank you very much, and congratulations to you and your entire team on a really remarkable piece of work.
Judy, it's been a pleasure and an honor to do this with you. I've been watching your work for so many years, so thank you for taking a moment to engage in this way. And our website is hungerward.org if people want to learn more about the film.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been my honor.